without further ado, I will hand you over to Chris, who's joined us from Elmhurst Energy. And Chris is here today to discuss the latest developments and confirmed changes to building regulations and Part L, which is the conservation of fuel and power. And this is following the much anticipated publication of the Future Home Standard consultation responses. So I hope I've said all that right, Chris.
Yeah, you did.
Stuff. We're off to a flying start then in that case. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Chris. And as I say, if you wouldn't mind putting any questions you have in the questions and answers box, we will look at those after Chris's presentation. Over to you, Chris.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity. I'll sort of start off with who I am. I'm Chris Ricketts. I'm the, for want of a better word, I'm the business manager of the consultancy team of Elmhurst Energy. So if I explain who Elmhurst Energy is and then where we fit in with that, that'll probably make a little bit more sense. So Elmhurst Energy is a group of companies. They're the largest sort of UK's accreditation scheme for energy assessors. So anyone that comes around, if you were selling your house, you're having an EPC on your house, or you're having a deck on a public building, display energy certificate that would be, or commercial buildings have EPCs as well. And we get involved with new build and retrofit compliance. And I head up the consultancy team in that group. And we specialize really in advice, services for the built environment and sort of energy management sector. So we sort of help clients, compliance with building regulations, energy audits, I suppose putting them on a pathway to reducing their carbon emissions and cutting energy costs. So that's where we get. I also get involved in a lot of research and technical reporting and modelling. And more recently, I've been involved in sort of looking at developers' specifications for their buildings, maybe commercial or even domestic, in particular, because they're interested in how they need to comply with this Part L and what's their ability to do so. But I will say that what I see coming out of this is that heat pumps are going to be a crucial technology to meeting our obligations. And hopefully this presentation will show you why I think that and how they can be effective then in meeting the sort of the next version of the building regulations. So I'm going to try and frame ourselves of where we are, any efficiency, the noise, the buzz that's in there, the finger on the pulse, the decarbonisation of our national grid, then this future home standard, which we were talking about, and then this building compliance element, which is about conservation of energy, the Part L1A being for new build, and there is a 1B for existing buildings. So that's the sections. I'll look at some of the recent developments. I'll look at that future home standard, how it's going to be implemented by sort of like building standards. And hopefully I can sort of lead you on this journey. This is if you were doing this course for Elmhurst Energy, a course you'd actually pay for, it's about 4 hours, and it's usually our energy assessors and retrofit coordinators that are doing that. And I've tried to strip out all of that detail and stop ourselves disappearing down rabbit holes, trying to give you some concepts so that you feel more aware and informed and knowledgeable about why your products, or what you're installing, or what you're liaising with your clients on the influences that are going on, and why heat pumps are really the way forward. So there's been lots of news about energy efficiency. Certainly I would say in the last couple of years, climate change, pollution events, there's lots of faces, lots of events. And in fact, I think probably 2019 was probably one of the ones that was, was a big sort of noise about it. There was highly anticipate developments. There was a committee on climate change. The UK and devolved governments all started making decisions about what they wanted to do with emission targets. There's reports going back to Parliament, about how are we going to reduce our greenhouse gases? How are we going to prepare ourselves for the impacts? We had David Attenborough, he had some hard-hitting sort of documentaries highlighting, what we were doing as the human species on our planet. And if we carried on the way we were going, we were doomed. So all of this pressure was going on, and the energy industry was getting a lot more attention, and there was definitely, I would say, a wider public understanding of those kind of issues. We all understand about energy efficiency. We all started to understand more about climate change. And we saw then that the Chancellor then was making statements in his spring statement in 2019, and they said, we're discussing a future standard. And that's the reason for this webinar today. It's that there was a number of events going on, which I don't think we'd seen before. We had tickles of it, but it didn't really come through. But I think that it came to a head. And you sort of then had this situation where you had all this attention, a wider understanding going on, and the government started doing certain sets of consultations. So they would come out to people like yourself, they would come out to policymakers, there would be research being, funds being generated, of which we were getting involved with. And in fact, even Boris Johnson the other day started talking about accelerating our plans, because we've got this 2050 target that we're trying to achieve. And there was this whole sort of report done called the Green Growth Strategy, and ultimately they decided that needed updating. If we just carried on the way we were going, we weren't going to achieve where we needed to get to. And this essentially was this 2032 pathway they were talking about. So the government came under a lot of criticism. They'd been sort of inactive. Some of their policies hadn't really been updated. And if we just carried on building buildings the way we were doing, there was a prediction pretty much, we were just going to, as the graph will show, we would just increase our CO2 emissions. But if we were then to start, cranking up some of the pressures in the right kind of areas, to achieve the 2050 of what we would call net zero, the only way we were going to get on that flight path was, to say, okay, we've got housing stock, it's aged, we can't carry on building it at older energy efficiency standards. We're going to have to improve their standards. We're going to have to improve the heating systems that go within that. The last 5 to 6 years are not going to work. So they turn that into, okay, so we're going to put a flight path, we're going to create some standards, and we're going to have some milestones as we achieve it. We're not just going to go, bang, everybody's got to achieve this overnight. We're going to make everybody move towards that. So the government's very good at their sort of nudges, so we say, for I want a better word. And so they came up with a sort of this clean growth strategy. And that was all about growing the national income whilst cutting greenhouse gases and their emissions. And hence we'd seen noises about, trying to be a leader in the wind farm technology. They wanted us to sort of lead the way. And I think, it's actually quite good that the government are doing that. And as a consequence, I think there will be lots of employment within this kind of sector. One of those things was a big commitment to review building regulations. So that's new buildings going forward. And as a consequence, then every new building going forward would have to comply to a standard, but then we would have to go back and look back at the existing stock and improve that stock. And then they started putting other sort of levers in place as well. So if you were private rented homes, by 2030, you won't be able to rent that unless it achieves an EPC band C. And they're going to do the same in the commercial sector, the industrial sector. So there's little levers the government will be doing to make sure that we are heading on this pathway. And while this was all going on, we were obviously part of the European Union. We did leave, obviously, but what they did do is they enshrined a lot of those laws that we had in place, those environmental laws, into UK law. And that was a great step for installing, I reckon, a lot of confidence in this sort of energy sector. Even if we hadn't done, we would still had the UN sort of Paris Climate Change Agreement. And there were some clean growth missions that we had about improving standards and reducing carbon. But the last number of slides, as you can see, the government, I think, has sat there and have said, yeah, we've got to work towards a major improvement in energy efficiency. There's been highly motivated by public image and events, and therefore I think they've really got behind it. So that was the sort of landscape that we were sort of working within, and it's still going on today. And there are research grants that are coming out looking at the non-domestic stock, so that's the commercial market. How do they classify that? How do they work out how to build policy around improving that stock within the time frame that they want to do so? What we see actually is a lot of the stuff that happens in the domestic sector sort of comes into the non-domestic sector, but it's usually a little bit of a shift somewhere between a year or two behind it. That is probably because it's easier to attack the domestic sector because there's lots of repeatable archetypes. There's lots of houses at the same size and shape and form, really. One of the other areas we're looking at is the decarbonisation of the grid. To develop, I suppose, effective regulations, we need to understand what has happened in the past and what is predicted to happen in our energy generation in the future. And decarbonisation essentially is that reduction of the associated carbon emissions with the provision of the service, in this case electricity, into the national grid. And what they're trying to do is reward the correct fuels and penalise others. So coal clearly is a dirty fuel. Oil is a dirty fuel. And so just want to have a look at the electricity grid, how it's decarbonised more rapidly in the past sort of decade and where they predict it going in the future. So certainly renewables, and when I talk about renewables, I'm talking about PV and wind. So that's solar and wind and hydro. And they have increased fourfold since 2010. And fossil fuels are down about 51%. If you compare to 2018, it's down about 6.3. Most of the decrease has actually come from coal generation. A massive decrease, something around about 59%, I think, compared to 2018. And renewable generation has increased then sort of 9.5% in 2019 compared to the previous year. And you've got things like wind and solar, which have increased by about 11% in the 2019 compared to 2018. Nuclear, interestingly, which is classified as a clean fuel, fell by about 13.6% in 2019, which is being one of the lowest levels of nuclear generation. But there is clearly been a turn of removing coal. So you're still getting gas-fired power stations in there. And, we've seen a massive increase then in the renewables feeding into the network. So if you look at the future, what they're saying is electricity is becoming a clean fuel. So they're saying, we see this as a way to move towards our net zero obligation. So this won't just be for buildings. Obviously, this will be for other areas like transport. So if we all have electric cars and we're using electricity on the grid, and that electricity is being powered by solar and wind, it is a clean fuel. So they're seeing renewables building, and the generation then is being driven more than by renewable technology. Natural gas, they're expecting to decay, and we may have to import some in some areas. It depends on, I suppose, grid demand and energy use, and and that's part of the challenge that they have is, development of a strategy also means that people increase their usage, but what they're trying to do is reduce the demand per sort of footprint. So somebody's home, instead of using 15 kilowatt, uses 10 kilowatts. So it's all about reduction per sort of area to allow that expansion in growth in our strategies. This is if you can go to this is a my grid gb.co.uk. If you go on it, and you can see the present sort of electricity mix in Britain today. So this was a snapshot done a couple of weeks. In fact, I just did it about an hour ago. Interestingly enough, it was we're 43% from low carbon sources at the moment, and it was producing something like 35 kilowatts. with an intensity, a carbon intensity of somewhere around about 261, it was an hour ago. So, you know, but if we want to target for 2050, you know, and we've got this milestone at 2030 of being 50 to 100, we're still way off it at the minute, you know, but compared to 10 years ago, that is a massive move, you know, that is, you know, but what that is representing is that electricity is being seen as a renewable source. So where does that fit us? So this comes to the future home standard. So that clean growth strategy where the government sort of announced, you know, we've got to get ourselves on a pathway. You know, we're going to do this future home standard. You know, so we want all new homes from 2025 to be 75, 80% less carbon emitted than homes built today. You know, so, and we're in building standards that are 10, 11 years old in some instances. And just the way some of those standards are allowing homes to be built. So a developer in current times, before the new standard comes into play, if they start on a plot and the standards change, they can finish the plot to an old standard. You know, that's you know, so you think you're buying a brand new house, but actually it might be built to an old compliance standard. And obviously, to achieve this standard, there are certain milestones they're going to put in place and changes to the building regulations to keep the buildings of dwellings on this flight path. So it doesn't all happen at once, but this impact is definitely going to have an impact on the uptake of heat pumps. And essentially, they've done all of these consultations, and these consultations went on. Probably COVID did have an effect upon it, but this future home standard, for want of a better word, is their defined path by 2025. What do we want the standard for domestic and commercial buildings to meet? You know, with 40% of our sort of UK total energy use coming from buildings, from heating and powering a building, you know, if we can affect that, then we're having a big effect upon our carbon emissions. Transport is another big one after that, you know, which is why we'll see the drive towards sort of electric vehicles. And if we can set the standards for buildings, you know, from a thermal efficiency point of view, so we can reduce the amount of energy that needs to go into them, and we can make sure that we drive them to using a low carbon heating source, then we're going to reduce energy and carbon emissions overall. And in doing so, they were going to raise the standards of all buildings being built today and then being renovated. And that's their positive step in meeting our targets. So this actually is talking about England. So we obviously, as devolved states, we've got Scotland and Wales. And what's interesting is they often follow not long after the standard. So England will produce their standards, say this is what we're going to do. Scotland likes to then come in and they may tweak certain areas, usually probably just go a little bit further. And Wales seem to be in line with us at the moment with the English one. But they're all out in discussion at the moment, but they will certainly follow this kind of path. So the new standards for building properties would encourage a real high thermal efficiency, low carbon heating. And in practice, developers are going to expect to meet that through tightening their fabric standards. So they're going to have to improve the specifications of their walls, their floors, their roofs, you know, what windows they put in. They probably have to do some kind of on-site generation like a PV. And they're going to have to fit other energy saving sort of measures like wastewater, heat recovery. But definitely, although we'll see an interest in installing low carbon heat. And sort of implied out of these standards is that the initial proposal was they expected heat pumps to be the primary heating system for new homes. And when they went to consultation, that actually was a decision that was supported by about 70% of the consultation from respondents, you know, and they said heat pumps, key role to play in the delivery of this standard. And it sort of came out then just went into abeyance for a long while, and then obviously at the beginning of this year it sort of got published, and they had a couple of proposals in there, sort of saying, well, you know, do we uplift by 25% or 31%? You know, we've got standards today, and we want to improve it. Just how far do we move? Do we make a big move now so it becomes a little bit easier to make another move later on? The consultations, you know, is essentially ran from October 29 to 2019, that would be, to February 2020. And then they obviously got published then at the beginning of this year. And it's expected that all new homes will not be able to be heated with gas, oil, or LPG. You know, so that means electricity is going to be the power source. Homes are going to have very high standards, probably be triple glazing, and heat pumps, therefore, will probably be the default solution, or heat networks. You know, and they anticipate, you know, the increase of heat networks. You know, and interestingly, you know, I think heat networks will be a challenge area, and actually that will be an industrial heat pump solutions. I think will feed into that, along with sort of like mining, water, that kind of stuff. But out of the sort of respondents that came back to them, you know, as I said earlier on, 70% felt that heat pumps had a role in the future home standards. 26% said we wanted it, you know, we think heat networks will be a good solution. There was a quite low number sort of talking about direct electric heating. But there were some concerns that were being written about of heat pumps and quality of design and installation, and the changes in consumer behaviors, and would the supply chain be able to support that? And I suppose that's the challenge for us in this industry to prove how we can do it. You know, they also talked about this heat networks, you know, and that's a great way for exploiting that sort of larger scale renewable, you know, recovered heat sources from energy from waste, and waste heat in sort of industrial processes, and heat from rivers and mines, that kind of thing. So I think we'll see some sort of like research and development going on within those kind of areas. So they came up with this initial sort of timeline, and you'll see there was you know, from them saying, yeah, we're going to do something, there was a whole bit of research they're going to have in place, and they're going to do some case studies and develop some evidence. And, you know, with 2025 being this sort of future home standard, and for that to be in place, there will be some early adopters. And I'm talking to some developers now who are building some future homes at that new standard, because the challenge for a developer is, how do I get that repeatability, you know, at a good cost, without being penalizing, you know, homeowner then in buying that property. And there was a whole chat that got discussed in this consultation and said, you know, are you going to accelerate it? You know, is 2025, you're going to bring it to 2023? And in the end, they produced this new sort of thing. And they said, look, okay, let's clarify how we're going to do this. You know, so we are going to accelerate our move a little bit more. We're going to bring forward a consultation on the spec, you know, the new spec, and it will be an improved standard from where we are today. So this new building reg is an interim stage. You know, it's just the first thing to step us towards where we need to be. There's a lot of work we've got to do, you know, so we're going to set up some technical working groups. We've got an industry task force. We're going to do some case studies on housings that have been built to these 2021 standards, and look at the people with the early adopters, where their challenges are in the marketplace, you know, and that will look at supply chain of products, and, you know, which low carbon technology is being used. And then further out, that standard, that specification standard will be in place from 2025, and that will be reducing a house compared to a standard today 75-80% less emissions. You know, so that's a massive move from a house that you can go and buy today compared to what you will be able to buy in, you know, 3 or 4 years time. You know, and with that is probably going to be the prohibition of gas central heating, which is the default solution today for a developer. Now, will they outright ban it? I don't know, but I think what will come in place you will see probably a prohibition of future connections to gas networks. you know, so they will make it difficult, you know, to get round this problem. So what is it? What are these changes? You know, so, and this is the section to sort of like talk you through it. So point of note, that today, when you get involved with building compliance, particularly around energy and things like that, the local authorities can actually impose a stricter regulation than the national standard. And there was a whole debate about whether they should remove that and try and make an improved understanding nationally, you know, consistency and all that. It actually wasn't received very well. And in the end, the Ministry for Housing and Communities and the MHCLG essentially said, okay, we're not going to implement that. We will allow that to be in place. So you can still get the situation where I could go work for a local council and actually they may impose a greater standard. And a lot of them may be doing that because there's about 100 local authorities that have all declared climate emergencies. You know, so they themselves are turning the screw on, you know, and we've done some work with some of these councils about what they're doing with social housing, what they're doing with non-domestic buildings, what they're doing with industry. And Part L, you know, is the building regulation that looks at that construction of a building, new, you know, or it's a change of use. So sometimes, you know, it's this, I've got a shop and I'm going to make a dwelling at the back of it, make a maisonette or whatever it might be. And it sets that standard for energy performance and your carbon emissions, and it's for new and existing buildings. There is called a SAP, and a lot of you who are installing heat pumps will probably use an EPC to do your RHI application at the end of it, and that is an output from this SAP. It's a standard assessment procedure, and it's an approved methodology by government to calculate the energy performance of a building at design stage. So that's what gives you, you can go and build that building, and then when they've built it, they do an as-built where they say, did you actually install that installation? Did you install these products? And that's what gives them a certificate and their building compliance. And if they don't comply, you know, they have to find some method of compliance, and sometimes they have to go back and add some some technology like PV on the roof to try and offset then their carbon emissions, because today they're only being measured on carbon emissions, you know, as their standard. And interestingly enough, that meant that they wanted to try and set what appears to be competing sets of metrics. So it becomes quite confusing, and this hence why the software makes it a hell of a lot easier for us to work with. So these compliance metrics, these are targets then that are set in this SAP calculation and this methodology, and you will get say an on-construction energy assessor. He'll measure the building, he'll inputs all the envelope details, the ventilation, heating, renewables, feeds that all into the software, and he calculates then its performance against a set of standards. And every new dwelling has obviously now got to meet these new 3 compliance metrics. And as I said before, they only had to look at carbon emissions. Now they've got primary energy, and they've also got this fabric standard that's built into it. And originally they were looking at, in the original consultation, there was a whole discussion about removing fabric and saying, we won't worry about that. We'll just measure carbon, and we'll put cost in there as well. They wanted an affordability matrix in there. And there was a lot of debate about, one, the affordability bit they felt could be captured by using a couple of other metrics, so let's not build that into the equation. And then there was a bit of criticism saying that if you didn't put in a fabric compliance metric, you could end up with really poorly built buildings with low thermal performance being offset with, or being masked by, lots of green technology. You know, so sticking heat pumps in, sticking PV in, you know, all and heat recovery units, and in the end they decided actually they would not ban it, get rid of it. They would keep that sort of fabric energy efficiency standard in place. So all new buildings from next year So it gets published at the end of this year, and then there's a 6-month implementation stage. We'll have to then comply against primary energy, carbon emissions, and this fabric energy efficiency. And when you put it into the software, you put your building in, it then compares it against some target rates, which basically are a benchmark for a notional building of the same size and form of the building that you're actually measuring at the moment, but they've got some specified levels of fabric and building services, and they're actually quite tough, so surprisingly enough. So primary energy is one of the new ones, and primary energy looks at, I suppose, if you think about energy like coal, has got to be mined, it's got to be shipped, it's got to be brought to the place it's going to be burnt before it creates energy that can be put into the grid. And what they've decided to do is to say, well, actually, if you then use a renewable source, and there isn't a cost associated with that, there is no extraction of the fuels, there's no transport costs really, and generation may be cleaner and more efficient, its primary energy will be lower than some of the other fuels. And so they introduced this sort of metric as a mandatory target, and you're not allowed to exceed it. And basically, any fuel that takes a lot of energy to generate and to process and to transport, to get to the dwelling where it's going to be used, will perform badly in compliance calculations, and therefore will become more difficult to get your building through if you happen to be using gas or oil or LPG. So it's driving people towards using electricity. Hence, conversation earlier on about the decarbonisation of the grid. That's why they're doing so. So when they were thinking about, we want to have nearly zero energy buildings for the future, if we can get the fabric of a building really, really high, so you have very low energy loss, and actually we create heat by being in a building, so we don't have to put some additional energy into it. With the grid being decarbonised, actually, we're thinking then that energy efficiency of a building is less relevant, but the type of energy generation is quite important at this point. So let's take into place what upstream activities are in place. So reducing carbon is very important to remain as a compliance. To get this net zero, they wanted to minimize the impact on dwellings by using a national grid that is as renewable as possible. So hence, that's why they brought into this primary energy. And it's a factor. So basically, you look at the energy of your building when you calculate it, and then you times it by a factor. I'll come into that a little bit later on. Then you had, obviously, the energy efficiency standards. So this is your fabric of your buildings. So, if we want to achieve where we need to be on our trajectory for emissions, we needed to change that fabric quickly, and therefore there was this whole thing about, we have U values. So this is the transmittance of heat through your wall and your floor and your windows and things like that. So, there's a set of standards for what those fabric buildings should look like, but also how, when a wall joins a floor, how that's insulated and bonded, how windows are bonded into sort of wall, how insulation is then packed in between rafters and joists, so all of those sort of construction details are being looked at. And so one of the biggest jumps that they had in their consultations was they wanted this 31% reduction in carbon over existing standard. And so they had a whole look at, improved U values for floors, where the junction of a wall and a floor joined together, air tightness of a building, how airtight your building is, with draft proofing, with gaps around doors in its construction, they all lead to a highly efficient thermal building. And then obviously it's about waste heat recovery, whether that be from ventilation systems or from water. And so they set this target, with these low view values, gas boiler actually with some PV values on the roof, in modelling, they saw that the average increase would be about nearly 4,600, nearly £5,000 for, and that's the kind of work I'm doing with some developers at the moment, small and large, looking at their specifications against building standards today and building standards which they would like to be in the future, what those costs of those components or their construction methodology, because obviously, smaller ones tend to have their own team of people that work for them. The bigger builders use subcontractors. So, their challenge is getting that repeatable sort of option in place. And one of the targets that they've set going forward as well is a lower flow rate. So today, a boiler in my house, is 8271, but you can't do that for the future. The standard is already moving it down to 55-degree flow rate, which will make it very much more demanding, and I think will emphasize the use for carbon heating, but also it starts to future-proof it. So if somebody does build a house tomorrow with a gas boiler, they have to have a flow rate of 55, which is making it fit the low carbon technology for the future. And this is all this comparison for this target against this notional building. And you're competing with a building of the same size, but it's got different efficiencies, that are built into it. So fuel factors. So currently today in our building standards, there was a whole challenge really, because you had people that were in cities, urban, rural environments, off grid. And so there was penalization really if you were off gas. There was a whole move to getting people onto gas. It was the most efficient form, and it is. It's a great way of heating your home and doing your heating hot water. And there was, a challenge there if you're using an LPG and the efficiency associated with that. And so they used to have this fuel factor in the current standards, which sort of didn't penalize you then for having to use LPG or oil when you're off grid, and therefore you wouldn't necessarily have managed to get compliance. So with the grid decarbonising and the drive to making us have non-fossil fuel heatings in the future, they said we're going to take away those fuel factors. That means we're going to take away any competition sort of and overtly supporting any one fuel over another, so there'll be no extra reward, so everybody will be on the same level field, and you'll be compared on your primary energy for that kind of fuel and the carbon emissions that come with that. So that led to them. So this is the so SAP 2012 that's the second column you can see in my graph. So that was where they sort of like normalized, made everything sort of similar. So it didn't matter if you're a mains gas, oil, LPG. They weren't too different to make it. And in fact, electricity, had a poorer CO2 associated today, but with the new standards, they improved dramatically. They literally go down 73%. With it now being the lowest producer of carbon, they decided they were going to reflect that in their modelling in the SAP model software, and hence that's good for heat pumps, because obviously electricity is one of your, if you run your heat pump on that and you got a good coefficient, 2.5, 3, sometimes more than that, and carbon is one of those building regulations metrics. Means that electricity will be very low carbon emissions compared to gas. It therefore will be a lot easier to comply to the carbon standard in compliance by using electricity, which again supports your sort of products. So we did some modeling really. So we took, I suppose, whenever there's this kind of change, the first thing we get is a load of phone calls from lots of different people, particularly developers, and they want to review their specifications, and they go, and quite often, most of them today are already exceeding existing standards, but they're probably not good enough to comply in the future. And what they want to know is, how much of my spec do I have to do a complete rewrite, or have I got to tweak certain aspects? And heating is one of their biggest influences on their overall energy efficiency. So they currently use gas boilers as a default sort of application. But the new metrics of the decarbonising grid may not make that the best energy efficient sort of solution for the future. So we took some existing buildings, current spec, just to get an idea if we then implemented the new changes. Didn't change anything in there, but just change, say, the heating source, what would the winners and the losers look like? And interestingly enough, so here's a comparison. This is a current building, compliant today, and we then put it in against the compliance targets for this next version of Part L. So I'm only looking at the carbon emissions and the primary energy at the minute. So they're two of the sort of metrics, because obviously I'm keeping the fabric standards to the current standard today. And this shows the sort of relative performance of the different types of fuels and the heating systems. And you'll see that some achieve compliance quite easily and some will be a lot more difficult. And as a consequence, they'll have to then influence other areas. So carbon being one of the metrics, the predicted carbon emissions are in the sort of left-hand column, with the maximum amount, which is in the right-hand column. And you'll see that sort of oil, LPG, they've got the highest emissions of all the fuels. They wouldn't comply just by default. But actually, if you were a standard heat pump you would have put in today, just take it out of the database that's built into SAP, or direct panel heating, I could take a building today, just put a heat pump into it, and I will meet its carbon emissions on compliance, tick. Don't have to do anything else on that bit, but I'd have to do something else because of my primary energy. My primary energy target is, 44.63. With a heat pump, it's 63.4. So I'd have to make some kind of difference now. So what do I'd have to look at, say, the fabric of my building, improving the fabric of the building to reduce the amount of energy that goes in it, and therefore reduce that primary energy down. And I might find just increasing a wall value might do that. Or I could be adding some PV to the roof and do some offsetting technology. But and different manufacturers. And this is a standard heat pump, which just comes out of the database. But different manufacturers, when we've done work for manufacturers and we've modeled their products, and they're interested in understanding how their products fit in different archetypes. You get a difference for a flat compared to a semi-detached, to a rural environment, to an urban environment. So we do a lot of that kind of modeling as well. But you can see, there would be just some tweakers probably on the fabric, and you could use a heat pump. But if you were using a mains gas boiler today, you've got significantly further to go, and the cost of that to a developer might be a bit onerous. So I can see that it's going to drive people towards low carbon technology, because that's an easy thing to do, and it will make less of an impact then into the cost for a developer to look at his specification for his U values on his fabric, or even the amount of PV he has to put on a roof. So every panel he has to put on is an additional cost. So interestingly, you notice in there that sort of direct panel heating, it performs worse than the metrics and heat pumps, and that's because it has a lower efficiency. It's because you've got for 1 kilowatt coming in, I'm actually putting 2.5, 3 kilowatts into the building. That's whereas it might be 100% efficient, taking 3 kilowatt in, putting 3 kilowatt out, or 99%, but it's not got that multiplier associated with it. So thinking about that, final thoughts, the next decade, electric will become the favoured method of powering homes, which leads towards heat pumps being a prime source. Oil, LPG, mains gas clearly are going to get phased out, I think, in building regulations by 2025. And from now, I think it will be that oil and LPG will simply not be a cost effective, in a new home, due to the amount of work it will need to sort of offset that carbon and energy use in them. Low temperature heating is going to be future proofed into those homes. With this flow rate being moved down to 55, we may even see it move further. They move 35, 40, I don't know. But the future then, if we've got this milestone in place, that means that the switch to a heat pump at a later stage means there will be less of a, limited amount of work required to do so. The challenge today, and other bits of work I look at, is how much existing radiators are oversized today that you could put a heat pump in without having to make all those system changes that people need. So that's the sort of final thought of that. Last couple of slides. So this is just where we are. That was an overview, landscape, future, compliance. Why I think it ticks all the boxes that heat pumps are going to be the default position going forward. We do a lot of testing and evaluation and research. My sister company does all the compliance work and the accreditation. And back over to you now if there's any questions.
Hi, thank you very much for that, Chris. We do have a couple questions. Matt Collins, sorry, Matt, I don't know if you can be a bit more specific, because obviously I think we've passed that point in the presentation now. This method, I'm not sure which one's referring to there, will put pressure on the grid by electrifying heat and replacing gas. Will the electricity infrastructure be able to cope with the increased demand?
Well, that's a good point. And it's interesting that there are, to me, I agree with that statement. And this is where I think the government has its challenges. And I know that they set up lots of sort of research into these sort of areas. So there's some research going on, which I was talking to Oxford more recently, and where they're trying to overlay all of these pieces of data of information, with energy generation companies, the network, the users. This is why they like the idea of smart meters, because this gives you a bit more visibility of where that use is being done and where the constraints come into place. And that leads then to planning developments, so don't carry on building over here, because that puts too much of a constraint or bottleneck on the grid here. And exactly, I think the point you've just made there is that as we move towards electric vehicles, the challenge comes, well, actually we're increasing our, the capacity that we want coming through it. So yes, I think it will do, but it is being built into their research and their policy developments, but they have, they can't just tear up and got a blank piece of paper, they start from scratch. They have to keep building on what's been done. And I think we'll see those nudges then into Ofgem, into the network providers, into you and us. We'll have storage facilities. I think we'll see, this is my own ideas. This is Chris Ricketts, not necessarily me knowing anything, but I wouldn't be surprised to see more battery technology being used in homes, so that, we then all have a capacity being stored, which we can be taken and drawn back into the grid and being topped up, and when you plug your car in, your car's being charged. And actually, it's also being used as a resource, to draw off at perhaps at the later stage overnight. I think there will be a lot more development in that kind of movement of electricity, between lots of storage areas. So definitely we'll see some development on that.
We've also got a question from Damon asking, I don't understand how panel heat does so well. Is it because of zoning?
Does so well as in from the CO2 point of view. The only reason why it does well from a CO2 point of view is it's using electricity from the grid, and the grid factors that they're obviously allowing there says it has a low CO2 factor. So that's the reason why it complies well with that. What it doesn't work well with is ultimately its primary energy won't be good, because it just needs to reduce the amount of energy. That this is where they have all these competing metrics. So it may hit one tick on the box here, but it won't hit the next one. And therefore, to make that happen, you then have to say, well, I have to improve my fabric in such a way so that I reduce the amount of energy that I put into this building. So I can still use direct energy. I can use a panel heater, but I need to take a third off, the amount of energy into the building just so that I could hit my primary heat factor compliance method. So this is where why they put 3 metrics in place, because they're trying to drive one, use a low carbon technology. So try and use something that is low CO2 in the first place, hence electricity. But 2, you can't just get that on its own. You're going to have to improve the fabric of your building, because we want your building to be more firmly efficient. We don't want you to be drawing 15 kilowatts of heat from any source. We want that to be 10 or 5 or even less. So they're looking for highly efficient thermal buildings, going forward. And as we make our buildings more firmly efficient, we then have the challenge of, so there are other then standards. Then we have standards around ventilation. So we make our buildings more airtight. So then we have to be concerned about the indoor air quality. So then there's minimum standards of air quality. And so then you get this sort of heat recovery and ventilation sort of standards building in place. And also, when you start thinking about the climate that we've been talking about and how we've been having hotter summers, the more buildings you seal in that kind of way, and we're looking at glazing in different ways as well, you then get overheating issues. So now there's an element of the standards that's looking at where do we think we're going to get overheating, and they think there's going to be a higher level of overheating going forward, and therefore they're building that into a compliance. This building could potentially overheat this number of days in a year. What are you going to do to offset it? So they're bringing lots of strands that all, you think you've done this one, you do this one, you go to the next one, right, what do I have to do to comply with this?
That's Chris. Just worth noting as well, our own Ground Source Heat Pump Association's policy team are actually working with the government on the consequences of electrification. This is, of course, an area where ground source really comes into its own in conjunction with the smart grid tech. Just thought I'd just make that point that we are doing that as an association ourselves at the moment.
Yeah, well, we were talking before we came on this webinar. We're talking about, I think the challenge for off-grid, and actually, I think there is a number of areas where I think the industrial ground source heat pump will make a sort of entry into the market, and that's because, take Nottingham for prime example. Lots of mines underneath it, all flooded with water, great stable environment for a temperature source. Why aren't we using that source for using either in a heat network, and that's what it probably fits best into a heat network, instead of each house having its own ground source into there, building a heat network and traveling and I used to work for Travis Perkins, and we used to do all of this kind of stuff for the heat network, with his energy from waste and stuff like that. There's lots of there is a plan to bring the whole of Britain connected up as one massive heat network. Whether it will happen, I don't know, but it's at the moment it's lots of areas, and there is a bit of research that's going up in the northeast at the minute as well. And there's, just in the background of all of this, there's lots of work going on as well. So you've got all the boiler manufacturers in a panic now going, okay, you're going to make it harder for gas. I'll tell you what, we can look at being hydrogen. Because hydrogen, when you burn it, what you're going to be left over with. You're just going to be left, it's just water. So they are doing trials at the moment for burners on boilers, and also they would have to then also look at things like your cookers, burners being able to use a hydrogen network. And that all goes back to a point that if you were to look at our national grid, the gas distribution national grid, it's worth something, as a brand new asset, something stupid like £800 billion or whatever. But it's there. Could you then have an hydrogen network then, instead of, so you've got all these competing technologies. They're all in sort of research and development, all going on, and some will come out better than others. I don't have the answer, because you've got to create hydrogen in the first place, and there's a whole debate about green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, you know, how eco-friendly is that in its own right, and, you know, the cost of generating that hydrogen in the first place. So, you know, it's all back down to this primary energy.
Quite a lot out there at the moment about the debate around that. I've got to say myself, even I've seen quite a lot. Yeah, quite a contentious debate at the moment. I've had a question off Dan. Can we update SAP 2012 to SAP 10 soon? Present is not out of date.
Yeah, so my sister company, the Elmhurst Energy, they created a beta version. So obviously we create the software based on the methodology the government gives us. So we actually have created this SAP 10 beta. So it is available through my sister company. I've got hold of it, and that's how I do my modelling, you know, for the future on it. But it's not the version that's for delivery yet, because you're always waiting for them to, at the final def, sort of like in December, say, yep, that's it, that's what we've produced, that's what the, you know, the standards will be that needs to be within it. But we've created our version, and it is out there. So there is a version available for you, you know, if you go to Elmhurst Energy. It's called SAP 10 beta, and that allows you to do that compliance modelling.
Quick question from Simon here as well, Chris. Existing housing in rural areas that may have restrictions on insulation improvements will still be reliant on oil and LPG systems.
Mm-hmm.
How will this affect them should the boiler fail? I'd say get ground source myself, but but that's what my answer to that is: get ground source heating, definitely.
Yeah, well, and that's, you know, so the new build standard, so when that will come into force, and then what follows after that is obviously the retrofit, or the, you know, the conversion. And I don't know the full detail there, but they may have, you know how you get some of these, I suppose you get allowances. You know, you're allowed, you know, for a period of time, 5 years, 10 years, post something, to be able to replace like for like. So as long as you are replacing with the equivalent carbon, so if you had a oil boiler and you replace it with a new oil boiler that wasn't any worse, you'd probably have some sort of like sign off that says you can have that within a period of 5 years. But long term, that will pass by, and they will have to adopt some new technology. And exactly where, you know, if they're off grid, then they're going to be looking at probably at using electricity, and heat pumps will be a prime solution for that.
Thank you for that, Chris. So unfortunately we are out of time now, so I'm sorry if we didn't get a chance to read your question out.
Went real quick.
It certainly did. It certainly did. Well, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, everyone.
No, thank you for the opportunity, and it was always nice, you know. So I hope it was of use to people. I hope it was of use. So.
I think we've got some very good feedback, Chris. We'll make this session available on our YouTube channel as well. So if you do want to recap anything Chris has said, please watch that. And also we will be putting up a link, if Chris would kindly share his slides with us. Yeah, there will be a link on the Ground Source Heat Pump Association's website to the presentation Chris did as well at some point. It won't be straight away, but it will go up there. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and keep your eye on certainly our Twitter feeds and LinkedIn, and you'll get to know some more of our free webinars. We try not to charge, because we think, you know, it's worth sharing the message about heat pumps, certainly. We're
one big network. We're all in lots of things, you know, and it's good to talk.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you again, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you. Cheers. Bye.